Hey guys, thanks for checking out this week's testimony. We are here with our friend Anthony Noto. Anthony, thanks for coming in and testifying.
Sure.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Hi.
So,
how are you guys?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, we're good. So you have been coming to the church for, almost 13 years.
Back on MLK.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember. I don't remember. I think maybe you were working on Sundays sometimes.
Yeah, when I first started on police work, I basically worked every weekend because I was new. So
yeah.
When I would come into church, it would often be I would get Sundays off on day shift, but on night shift I'd get home at like 6 a.m, go to bed at 7, and sometimes I would try and come in, but I stopped trying because it was.
Yeah, and Evan was very little, your oldest son, and he would always try to bolt out that door right onto MLK. And so, like, Sundays were over, we always had somebody assigned to watch the door to keep Evan from bolting out, because it was so terrifying to all of us, that he would try to run.
Yeah, and then Michael tries to bolt in and get the donuts.
Yeah,
10 years later.
10 years later, so.
I don't blame him for that.
Yeah.
And he is the son of a cop, so there's the whole donut thing.
Delicious.
Okay, so we want to hear your story. So yours and your wife's, because you guys have known each other for a long time, and
Yeah, it's been a long time.
yeah, it's been a long time. So take us back to the beginning.
Well, I was born in San Diego, California in '82.
Okay.
My parents were, they had drug addiction issues.
Did not
So
know this.
I was raised up in that. It got pretty bad for a while there. I have some memories of, my parents running from the police with me in tow. I was given a fake alias when I was born because my father was a fugitive. So I was given a fake last name. So did that for a while, hotel to hotel type thing, living off the streets.
This is like a movie. I feel like you're telling me a movie right now. That's crazy.
At some points, my mother and father would be staying in a hotel, and then I would leave for the day and collect cans and bottles. In California, you could turn them in, and that's how I would eat. And I'd come back, and they were gone. Either they were kicked out or couldn't pay. So I'd wander around for days till I found them again, and in the area. And I knew where they frequented.
How old were you at this time?
So I went to live with my grandparents, so second grade. So it would have been, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And I wasn't enrolled in school. So when my grandparents took me in, when my mother went to rehab, my dad had, he just left the scene. I wasn't enrolled in school, so I was a year behind. But I went from San Diego. We lived in Pennsylvania and Texas and all these other places, Maryland, but ultimately...
That was with your parents?
That was, with my parents.
Okay.
Back and forth. And then, one day, I guess, to my mother's testimony, I looked up at her one day and told her that I hated her. So that was enough for her to go to rehab. So then, she called Dad, and they took me in, and she went to rehab. And that's where my journey with Christ begins, because my grandparents were saved. Not always saved, they got saved later in life. So I did that for a couple of years. I did second and third grade in New Jersey with my grandparents. My mom got out of rehab. Everything seemed to be great, so I went back with her for fourth grade. Back into Maryland is where her mom lived, because my grandparents were divorced. So that didn't last long because she had a boyfriend. He was physically abusive, and my grandparents saw what was going on, and offered for me to come back permanently. So I took them up on that. So fifth grade, how old I would have been, I officially became a Noto. I took my mother's paternal name, and was adopted, got all the court stuff settled out, and then that's when I started.
10. Fifth grade's 10 years old?
Yeah, 10. So I've been a year behind, so 11.
Wow.
And that's when, God got a hold of me and really did some pretty amazing things.
Wow.
Okay. So tell us about how that happened. Was it in your grandparents' house? Was it at church? Was it at a camp?
They went to a pretty large non-denominational church in Wayne, New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I remember I went to like Royal Rangers, which would be like the Christian Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
And, I made some friends.
I was in that Royal Rangers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have good memories of it.
Yeah.
I don't remember a lot from that time period.
Yeah.
But I remember like at that church, it was kind of weird because, it was very traditional. You would go in and they'd have a choir and all the kids would sing for Sunday school, and then they would go back and, this same person would always speak in tongues and the same person would interpret it, and it kind of got wild. And I always remember like, this is kind of weird. I don't understand it. I don't know what's going on. And then I was put in a private Baptist school from 5th to 8th grade.
Okay.
Because my grandparents, I was a mess. So when I first went to live with my grandparents in 2nd grade, I was essentially feral. Like they had to teach me everything because, I was just living on the street.
Yeah.
So like, brushing your teeth, hygiene, how to talk to people. So I remember it was like my first week at this Baptist, and it was the principal was a woman, and the other, I guess she was the lead, like a minister, and she taught 8th grade, and they were very strict Baptist, like sit down, don't talk, whoosh, type of environment. Wow. But we were doing a math lesson, and we were using some kind of like Monopoly money, and I had like stuck the money in my shirt, and I was dancing, and my grandfather got called. So that's kind of like, that's what I knew.
Yeah.
Freaked everyone else out because most of the kids were growing, the gasps. So there were some tough times.
Yeah. You undid that Baptist school that day.
Yeah, there were some tough times in there. Yeah. For everybody.
Wow.
What really?
Were you shocked that you got in trouble, or did you know that you were causing a ruckus, or do you remember?
I don't remember exactly, but sometimes, probably in the beginning, I would say I wasn't sure, but there's definitely a time where like I knew what I was doing.
Okay.
I was being disruptive. Yeah.
But it made some people laugh, some people gasp.
Yeah, I didn't see the laughs. I'm sure they probably went home and laughed about some of the things, that went on. But my grandfather was very strict.
Yeah.
Mostly patient. Very corporal punishment. I had gotten in trouble one time and suspended from school, and the punishment was to cut the grass with scissors.
Oh, wow.
So I cut the grass with scissors, until my fingers were bleeding, and until I was allowed to go back to school again. So he was and I am so grateful for every second of it. But my grandparents wanted me to go to a youth group. They didn't want to drive all the way to Wayne with Royal Rangers because it was like a 45-minute drive. So I went to a church in town and started going to a youth group. It's where I met Rachel. And that's where God really got a hold of me.
And how old were you?
I was 5th grade is when I started. So probably like 6th, 7th grade, I really started to get drawn in. I became a Christian. I gave my life to God. The youth pastor is still such a close friend of mine. Really poured into us. Was very patient, with me and my grandparents. Ended up joining the youth worship band and that type of thing. I'd say that, that's really where it started. And it kind of became an issue. I mean, there's just so much, and I'm sorry, it's hard to keep track. My grandparents weren't thrilled with the church, and they wouldn't attend that church. But they had sent me to the youth group, and I didn't want to stop going, so it created conflict.
Tension, yeah.
Oh, okay.
One night they went out, and my grandfather remarried, so her mom, my great grandma, lived with us, and they went out one night, and I was grounded. I wasn't supposed to go anywhere, and I broke out and ran down the street and had a friend pick me up so we could go to a revival service for youth type of thing.
Good Christian thing to do.
I got in trouble for that. Disobedient, ultimately. But
that'd be a hard thing to decide if you're going to punish or not. I mean, obviously, you don't want your child to sneak out, but going to a revival service, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So the church had some issues
and
ended up splitting.
Okay,
and when I say revival, And that's a whole nother topic with the
Okay,
church and the
yeah.
pastor. You know,
Yeah,
that
for
pastor is now agnostic. So probably I question everything that happened from start to
But
finish.
but for you,
Gotcha.
you're being told, hey, these are church services. We're looking for the
Yep.
Lord to move, and
Yeah.
you're like, I want to be there.
Like,
Yeah, but I remember like they had some guy come in, John Paul Jackson, who's actually famous, and he knew our pastor, and they had a revival, and it's, you know,
that name is familiar.
yeah, he was supposedly a prophetic man.
Okay.
Yeah.
He ended up not being so. He passed. He's got all kinds of stuff on YouTube. But it was one of those services where you pray and you're touching people falling down, and it's getting wacky and crazy, and that ended up ultimately dividing the church. So, you know, that was towards the end of high school, and when Rachel and I just, you know, we went on to do other things, and the church kind of collapsed.
Okay.
So
So in the middle of this, when did Rachel become more than just somebody in the youth group?
So I remember it must have been 6th or 7th grade. We were on a youth trip, and they used to go on youth trips all the time.
Yeah.
And I remember the youth van broke down, and we were at a gas station.
That's a legit youth trip.
That's
Yeah.
a youth trip.
Yes.
And you know,
And I was sitting with one of my really good friends, and I don't know what kind of gas station it was, but we were on like a side sunroom type of building, sitting on a bench. And Rachel walked through, and we were there for hours, so we were milling around. It was miserable, but I remember looking at my friend, and I said, like, I'm going to marry that girl. And you know, I had a couple girlfriends that you have in high school, that type of thing. But ultimately, that was the moment. And you know, we were married. We've been married almost 20 years.
that's
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Yeah. We when I was a youth pastor, we broke down on the way back from an Acquire the Fire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these services, but they were big, you know, rallies that happened, and I got handcuffed and put in the back of a cop car in front of all the kids, and you know, just trying to make sure that none of the kids died. So, you know, it's interesting to think about like our youth experience growing up, and even us trying to be youth pastors, how different the world is today for that. You know, back in the day, it was, I mean, it was a Sunday night, I think it was a Sunday night, and we were from Nashville to Birmingham. We were just on the side of the interstate, you know, and just broke down, you know.
Yeah, we used to
at
have
night,
lock-ins, and you know, someone's always getting hurt. The stuff,
Yeah.
you know, you couldn't even do it now. You
No.
know?
Yeah.
We literally played a youth pastor sanctioned game where you had you know, the extension cords, and at the end, they call it pigtail, has like the 3 plugs.
Yeah.
Where you'd swing it around, and you wear a blindfold, and you'd step in and out until you got whacked by it, like that type of stuff. You know.
Wow. We never
So
played that.
yeah,
that's-
you know, so
That's a different level.
I can see why you're close with your youth pastor.
yeah, we were, you know, we were very, very close.
Okay, so something has to give though, because you're talking about finding Christ, loving the Lord, pursuing Rachel, and just before we started recording, you got arrested right outside of high school. So,
Well, no, he was
Yeah.
telling the story. He didn't get arrested right before we recorded.
no.
No,
Yeah.
These are not current events.
I said right outside of high school.
Stories.
So right out of
Okay.
high school, you were.
So
there had to be
I,
some give and take going on, right?
there were times in high school where, like, I was sold out. I was praying in the hallways, and there were times where I wasn't so great. You know, drug use came into play. I was very defiant at home. The home situation was extremely difficult. Obviously, my grandparents were trying to raise me.
Right.
Towards the end of high school, my grandfather was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. My grandmother was having some issues on top of that. I was getting in trouble. So, you know, I moved out junior year. So I lived with my friends in their basement with like no adult oversight.
Right.
So that put me in a really difficult time. And, you know, Rachel and I were dating at that time. So that's kind of how that happened.
How did she feel about your?
She put up with me. She was praying about it one night because we went through some struggles, you know, and of course at the end of high school, first year of college, you know, sometimes dating, like, okay, great. Like no one really takes it serious. I was taking it serious as in like I wasn't interested in dating or seeing anybody else, but I was also just doing my own thing. And Rachel was very, and still is, straight edge. Like she's going to follow the rules. She's, you know, going to do this when she's supposed to. She's going to be couth. She's going to be proper. I wasn't so. And, there's one time where it basically came to a breaking point where it's like, if you don't change something about you, I'm out of here. And I had tried college. I went for an art major. I was going to be a tattoo artist. I had all this stuff planned.
Nice.
Not responsible enough for college. That fell through. So I just joined the Army. I was like, well, if I just get away from all of this, right, I'll have a chance. There's nothing for me here. All my friends were doing drugs and getting in trouble. I didn't have a job. I had no prospect for a good job. I flunked out of school. So, and I always wanted to be a soldier, so it was an easy decision. So I married
Were you married yet at that point?
We weren't married. We got engaged before I went to boot camp.
Okay.
So Rachel was still living with her parents. I was still living in the basement with my friend. And it was like whatever day of the week it was. I was like, hey, we're hanging out. I was like, hey, I joined the Army. And I hadn't talked to her about it at all. That was just my solution. I'm going to solve problems, typical guy thing to do. And that upset her. But in her testimony, she had prayed about it. And our marriage has gone through extremely difficult times. A lot of it because of my behavior. But she got confirmation from God, like, this is the person you're going to marry. Right. So she was patient. She sought the Lord. She held on. And, God has blessed our marriage for that, I believe.
Yeah.
And when I went to the Army, that was another wild time. I had no Christian friends. My grandfather passed away when I was so you go to basic and then you go to your job training. And then I went to airborne school, jumping out of airplanes, and I had to get called home for emergency leave because he was dying. And then I went back, restarted some of the training, got called home because he passed. Then I went back, redid some of the training. Then I went to RIP, which would have been a pre-Ranger regiment training. I ended up not doing that. And then went to 10th Mountain because it was close to home. I was able to get orders thinking if I could be close to home, it'll solve a lot of these issues. Didn't solve any issues, but that time and maybe a year, 6 months out of the military was probably the worst. I really, really struggled and our marriage struggled. I was, of course you can say, oh, it's because of this, or, it's because of PTSD or whatever. All that stuff is kind of irrelevant. I wasn't seeking God.
Yeah.
So all that other stuff was allowed just to flourish, So I was drinking, I was abusing medication, I was making poor purchases and life decisions. And that came to a boiling point. Rachel, we were in Idaho at that time. Got out of the military, moved in with her mom for a few months to try and figure out what we're going to do.
In Idaho?
No, in New Jersey.
Okay.
Because her mom was still in New Jersey. Then I went to Idaho to visit a friend I was in the Army with, and I just never came home. I got a job. Rachel came home, packed our stuff, and we went to Idaho. Probably not a great decision, right? And so not plugged into a church, no community, out there on the other side of the country, no family.
I've never even been to Idaho. You're telling this story, and I'm imagining it geographically, and I'm I've never even been there.
Potatoes.
So
it's incredible.
You just went there
Famous
because
potatoes.
Yeah, that's what I'm
you
saying.
just went there because you visited a friend, and it was you just found a life. You just started a life.
Yeah, he offered part ownership of a business, and he was my squad leader in the military. We were fantastic friends.
Yeah.
And I was like, that sounds like a great idea. And we just decided it was a great idea, And we really wanted to move out of her mother's house. That was causing a lot of tension in its own. So it was that kind of fostered the decision.
Was he a believer?
No.
Okay.
No. It's well, here's an opportunity to get out of here. We're going to take it.
Did the deal end up being legit with the business?
It was.
Okay.
And we ended up having a falling out. And they cheated us. We ended up getting some debt. I got a job at a prison to make ends meet and save up, and we decided we're going to come back to this side of the country. So that took about 4 years, a little over 4 years, that experience, and we learned a lot.
Yeah.
And ended up in the end growing together, and still a Christian, believing in God, but just not seeking God, not being part of a good church, not getting into my word all the time. And God is so faithful, when he says he won't leave us. Right. You make a commitment to the Lord. I didn't renounce God. I just wasn't paying any attention. I was just doing whatever I thought was best. But God was there every step of the way.
Where did that begin to shift?
When we moved back here, we moved back got a job at the police department, moved back, and we found City Church shortly after. It wasn't until we tried a lot of churches.
Oh, so you guys moved from Idaho to here?
Yep, straight from Idaho right to Savannah.
And y'all, why did you pick Savannah?
They offered me a job first. So our goal was to get back to the East Coast,
I
close
got
to
you.
family.
I got you. Okay.
So, we have family, like Florida, up to Connecticut. So, I applied to like Chattanooga Police Department, Savannah Police Department, saved up for a plane ticket, flew out, did all the testing, flew back, and Savannah was the first one to call.
Awesome.
And,
Okay.
because of all the effort to even get it, I was like, I'll take it, and we packed up, moved out of our house and drove across the country.
So you got here, and go back to what you were saying about getting serious about your faith and all. Like, what was the leading conversation there? And
Well, it was my own misery, right? So, through the police academy, I was still struggling, making friends, drinking, just doing the normal, thing. And then, I remember having a conversation with you about how the Lord uses our children to like tap us on the shoulder. It's like, hey, like what you're doing is affecting this generation, this child, right? And when you hold a baby, it just does something to you. It makes you reflect on like, wow, what am I doing? What is my future? Why am I making these decisions?
it makes you aware of things you weren't aware of, for sure.
For sure. And then, the first, and it's hard to say. If Rachel was here, she'd probably be like, no, that wasn't happening. That's,
Yeah,
but,
I know how that feels too.
the first short stint at City Church, it was kind of like, oh, we're going to a church. This is what we should be doing. And then, it just, everything was falling apart. And God called me back, and I stopped, and I was like, okay, like this is, I've been ridiculous. And, so it's kind of a, one of these rides, throughout the years.
Yeah.
But,
in the midst of all of this, did you, if so, what was the experience? Did you get baptized? What was that experience like?
so I was baptized, at the Calvary Temple, the big non-denominational church that we went to. And I got saved through youth group, but we were still going to that church.
Okay.
So that was, I would say 5th grade, like officially.
Yeah.
I have a vague memory of somewhere between 2nd and 3rd grade. My grandparents sent me to some kind of youth camp, and it was a couple of days. You go and you stay, and they have like cabins, and they have like a little preaching and ministry. And I remember weeping and breaking down to the point, and I don't have a complete solid memory, but I remember that the people hosting and the chaperones were just like, didn't know what to do with me. And I know God did something to my heart in that moment, because there was a lot of difficulty and pain from, when I was in California with my parents and they were on drugs. I mean, there was abuse, there was neglect. I watched all kinds of things happen for drugs. People get shot, people get stabbed, running from the police, I watched my father get arrested and fight the police, and, he toted a whooping.
These are the things that are legit trauma. We hear the term trauma thrown around today, like, I missed a meal last week because I had to work an extra shift, and I'm just dealing with the trauma of it. It's like, that's really demeaning to, or diminishes, what some people really go through, which, is stuff that like really just creeps into your being that you have to fight through.
And it's still a battle, and then, joining the military and going to Iraq, right? That was no joyride either.
Yeah.
And I still carry a lot of those things.
Yeah.
But, in the pursuit of Christ, those things become a tool for his glory and not something to destroy my life. In our adoption, and Vivian and Josiah have had struggles that I can relate to because I went through it.
Yeah.
So God used that, right?
Yeah.
Or I could have just continued imploding and ignoring God, and that would have been just for devastation.
Right. So you guys have your biological children and you have your adopted children. Yeah. And so that's something that really, I feel like that we watched you guys go through the desire to adopt early on in your years at City Church. And then to see the fulfillment of that, that's amazing. I didn't know that your story included that, your grandparents adopted you.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. I have a question going back to when you were young and when you would leave and then you go back and your parents are there and you would wonder until you found them. Like, do you remember what was your sense of where to go, what to do? Like, I'm trying to think as a child, like, how do you know where to go?
So my mother had a friend, and she had a son, and I remember his name was Adam. So we would just stick together.
Okay.
And so it was San Diego on the boardwalk. So, we would run into people that we recognized that we know, and eventually we would get back to somebody that we knew, and we'd get back to our parents. Because, in that circle of drug use, everybody knows everyone. Probably most of the people are like, oh, this is that lady's kid. He's running around. And remember the old Pepsi, Coca-Cola taste test stands? It's kind of a boardwalk, carnival type thing. There were some college kids on the boardwalk that ran that, and they must have recognized that we were struggling children, and they would have us take cold drinks to like hot chicks on the beach, and then they would feed us, right? So we'd go find them, and they would give us these drinks, and they'd point out the girls, and we'd hand them the drinks, and they'd wave. So our job is done, and then they would buy us food, and we'd sleep under the boardwalk. So they kind of took care of us.
Interesting.
I remember, even as a young age, and of course God was watching over. We would go to car dealerships, and dust off the cars, and we'd get paid.
Okay.
Things like that to eat.
That's the type of scenario where bad things could have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some bad things did happen.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I mean, but to hear from where your childhood came to seeing your family with your wife and your 7 kids, like I see like a picture of redemption, and I know your life is not perfect. I know that your struggles are not over. It's, as long as you have breath in your lungs, you're going to be fighting something,
Yeah.
But that's really amazing to see that picture of redemption, looking at your family.
Where are your mom, your dad currently?
So I believe my dad's somewhere in California.
Okay.
My mother is in Florida, and to my knowledge, she is still using drugs.
Okay.
So that's kind of a strained relationship. I've gotten to the point where my perspective used to be like I was the victim, right? Now it's turned over, and it's like I'm not the victim. My heart breaks for the shame and pain I know they must feel on some level.
Yeah.
And my mother, we've tried to kind of have a relationship, and I've invited her out, but I think, and I don't talk to her very often. I mean, 5 minutes a year would be generous. That, she always, well, I'll do this or I'll do that or I'll come. And I've forgiven her, and I've had that conversation. But I think that she just can't handle what she did and, come around. And it's sad because she has 7 grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I don't blame her, because it took a long time for me to really accept the grace of God, right? Because I don't think as people we can fully understand it, but to the point where I can move on in my life and, tell other people about Jesus, knowing, like I don't have to be perfect, and I tried to get my mom to come into that, and I don't think she can.
What about siblings? Do you have siblings?
No, I'm an
You're an only child. Yeah. Okay. So
I know of.
Let me set the stage for you, right? So right now, you've got all your kids, and we were talking about just before this, you love all of them. They're all different. They all have different needs, and they'll probably all tell a different story one day. But hold on one second and let them make all that noise. Yeah.
They're getting ready for youth group in the room over. So a little bit of ruckus.
Quiet, guys.
Do you need to text?
I'll let Josh. Just ask them to be quiet. They do have to get set up for Corey.
I didn't even hear that until you said something.
It'll be clanging in the.
This always noise, so I just didn't even until you said clanging. I was just going right along with it.
Yeah.
They do have to get set up, and I get it. So they're not trying to.
Yeah, they're not trying to cause a problem.
No. In the first one we did with Lawton, Zoe was in the background going, Ezra! And he gets so loud. And I was like, no! It was like, bro, just, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. You ready, Josh? Okay. All right. So let me set this up for you.
Okay.
All right. So you've got all your kids, and they're all different, and you love each of them. We're 20, 30 years down the road, and they come back and they find this online and they're watching it, right? And they're thinking through their own life. What would you say to them as advice for them as parents, given everything you've been through, everything you've tried to lift them up to be?
It's a tough. I mean, my biggest hope, and what I try and share with my older kids, is don't ever attempt to abandon God, right? Life is tough. You're going to struggle. We're eventually going to fall ill or die, one each for life, So just to seek Jesus till you die. Like, don't ever give up on it. Even when you're in despair, don't ever walk away and try and do it on your own. That's what's caused the most issues with the things that have gone on, in my life. And then for Rachel to be my wife, like, there couldn't be two different people on this earth. Yeah. I mean, like, we were and we've grown together. But, even when we were dating and got married, everybody was like, this is not going to work. Wow. Like, that's a wild man and you're a proper woman, So
okay, have we given you any outline or script to follow for this at all? Okay. No. The reason I ask is because this is a consistent theme. Like, your answer to this has been consistent in several conversations that we've had. Yeah. And so it's amazing to hear that, because you're right. Like, don't walk away from your faith and don't walk away from Christian community. That's been a theme. And then the wild man and proper woman, that's a little bit of a recurring theme too, but that's so funny.
And that seems pretty like, the quintessential love story, right?
Yeah.
Like, the woman falls in love with a biker guy, and type of thing. But, don't walk away from God, because you can't do it, no matter what it is. Right. You won't overcome it.
Yeah, the biker guy fails at life unless he comes to know Jesus.
Yeah.
He can hang on to everything else he's got in his life.
He'll lose it all in the end.
He'll lose it all. Yeah.
He'll lose it all.
Jesus is the only hope there.
Yeah, that would be my critique. And I have regret for opportunities I have missed. I spent 27 months between Baghdad and Fallujah and didn't speak one word of Christ to anyone I came across. That opportunity I had, people can't get that opportunity. Right. God provides it, and God is doing things there. But from that perspective, I was in a whole nother world. And if I had stopped for a second and got into my word and said, God, help me, it would have been different. War or not. But in the absence of seeking the Lord, it's just destruction and devastation and regret is the only result.
Yeah.
And I can't even say, oh, well, it was war, so it was justified for me to behave this way. That's not true.
Well,
that's wild.
The running theme that kind of built this idea out is that the scripture says that the enemy is defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. I say this a lot, and the blood of the Lamb has been shed, and us learning to share our testimony is really, I really believe it is the gap between victory and defeat. The blood of the Lamb's already shed. If we want to see the enemy destroyed, if we want to find victory in our lives, we have to learn how to be ready to just share what God has done, who God is, and in our lives specifically. Like, we've got the word of God, and we can tell and point people to that, and we should point them to that. But there's also something about the weight of, now let me tell you what that has done in me and through me and how it's made me. And when we can learn to do that more comfortably, and the weight of what you feel, while it may be a missed opportunity, what certainly God has done is made you acutely aware of the importance of sharing the gospel, of sharing your story now, and not taking it for granted. And so I would think that there won't be a season in your life again where you're not ready to speak. And that means that God can put you in some really great places, because he can trust that, you're not going to make another,
And I think too, like,
decision like that.
People who see your family who don't know your story, they see a family, I'm sure, that is put together. There's a husband, there's a wife, there's 7 kids. Like, they're functional. You guys are doing amazing things.
And they're all happy.
Coming, serving at Red,
at least in public.
kids. And I mean, the work that you guys do on your land to like provide and things like that. So I think it's important, first of all, for families to be seen in society and to be functional. And then secondly, I think the testimony is powerful because you give hope to younger couples who are starting out or who may find themselves in those first wrestlings where it's like, we're at the crossroads of, okay, are we done with our marriage or are we not? You know, are we done with pursuing Jesus or not? Because I've tried this, you know, and maybe the grass seems greener. But then to have a picture of a functioning family in society that's like, hey, just because there's a struggle doesn't mean you can't do it, you know? And I think that's what's important for us to see is that, okay, you know, no family is perfect. No marriage is perfect. And sure, you're going to struggle, but you're going to make it through.
Yeah.
You know?
And, you know, I guess I would also say to my kids, you know, and other people listening, you know, when the decision to love somebody comes with risk and hurt often. So when Rachel and I decided to adopt, and Rachel was on board first, and I was like, no way, right? From family dynamic and difficulty, and, you know, life is already tough enough. And through prayer, I came around. And so you fast forward a few years, and taking 2 children coming from poor family, abuse of their own, drugs, you know, not knowing parents, and just inserting them. And then you have racial differences, which doesn't matter to us, but there is an effect. Mm-hmm. You know, it makes this isn't just right seem more in your face. And it's never been an issue, but I can tell that, you know, especially Vivian, when she looks at other people in public, I can see her thoughts. One thing doesn't look like the other. I don't quite understand, but, you know, what's going on. And, but there have been times in that struggle with the difficulties it created with our paternal children that I have gone to my room and completely just sinned and spit in God's face by saying, I should have never done this. I regret doing this. I destroyed my family. I'm done. What was this all for? You know, I hate it. I hate the fact that I made it but at the same time, at the end of those breaths, God help me. And just getting down on my face, and God is there. So it's not easy. And when families get to this crossroads of difficulty in marriage or difficulty with whatever it is, that difficulty is always going to be there. And a lot of people don't speak about it. So it happens at home because, you know, they don't want to say anything, or it makes you seem like to share that, like, oh, well, I'm not strong enough to do it. I'm not smart enough to do it. I made a mistake. I did this. And God reminds me, like, my grace is enough. I will give you what you need when you need it. And he has never failed, even in my obstinance in trying to run from the problem. You know,
That's good.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And through all of that, you know, from adopted to paternal, everybody's watching how dad navigates. And, you know, that's one of the things that is really important for me, is that I constantly have to come back and go, like, my kids are watching how I navigate the problem. They're watching how I adapt, how I pivot. They're watching how I respond. They're watching how I love. They're watching how I hate. They're watching how I cry, you know. And so doing some of that in front of them, I think, is really important. Being transparent to some degree at times is really important, so that I'm helping to equip them down the road that they're going to be making decisions, and maybe they can look back and go, you know, this was a really difficult season. I remember how dad responded, how dad acted, what dad did. And then again, the other side of that too is when I do get it wrong, being really quick to just simply apologize so that they can know that I also make mistakes. I'm not just pointing out your mistakes. I'm also pointing out mine, you know.
That's really hard for me.
Yeah.
Not the saying I'm sorry. There have been some conversations where I'm like, listen, I was wrong. You know, I shouldn't have yelled. I shouldn't have done this. You know, you were still wrong. You know, but I shouldn't respond that way. But what's really difficult for me is the type of man I have become because of my past. And that doesn't justify being coarse or ultra type A. But like, for example, we had a pet pass away, we had a little family thing. Like, I felt no emotion. So there are effects on my body, and my emotions from how I grew up.
Sure.
Being in Iraq, being a police officer.
Yeah.
So I struggle greatly to show empathy and come down to a level because I'm always so like, well, this is how it is. It's going to be fine. God's going to fix it. We'll get through it. Just put your head down, go through it, stop complaining.
Yeah.
And that's not always appropriate, but that's kind of who I've become. And that's how God made me. I would assume for the tasks that he's given me in life,
Sure.
right? To be able to accomplish those
Right.
things and not fall apart completely
Right.
after.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
you
that
know.
just remembering that God does this well for us. God looks at the earth in Genesis 6 and regrets having made man, right? And yet he pauses and grieves, and he goes, it'd been easy to just lash out, but there was an aching. Jesus and all of his discipleship and teaching always paused, to minister to the kids, the scripture tells us. And so, like, you're right. Like, you have had a life that has made you who you are, and that's part of your testimony. But there's probably aspects of that. There's aspects of my childhood that I don't want to go forward. So some of those things I have to compartmentalize around the kids so that they don't learn it as a trait that they carry forward.
And I find that to be difficult.
Yeah. I imagine that it is. You have again, going back to like what a lot of people throw around as far as what they've been through, you have some real
Yeah. It's hard to go
things
home
there
and try to justify my behavior or my mood to my
Yeah.
children. Like, well, you don't know what I just did.
Yeah.
So my natural recourse is to protect them and just like, they haven't heard this story of this nature, right?
Yeah.
And most of my kids wouldn't be able to understand it anyway because it's all about perspective. But when you're at work and there's a car wreck and someone's trapped inside a car and you watch them burn to death before the fire department can get there, and then I have to go home and my boys are in a discipline mode with mom and this is going on and that spills.
It's like a
and
switch that
I
you
walk in the door and sometimes I'm just like,
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. What are the ways that you have found that you have an outlet? Do you run? Do you like physically run? Do you work out? Do you sleep? What do you do to kind of like have your outlet for what you need?
I haven't been working out as much. I had a position change at work a year ago, so the last year it hasn't. But yes, exercising, running a lot. Running is the absolute best. My knees aren't so much into the running anymore, but and when I really hit bottom, just stopping, going and being alone, praying and reading the word.
yeah.
That is the thing. And I know we all need an outlet, right? Because you talk about like, well, you need to eat well, you need to exercise. Those things are all important too, and even biblical. But, I'll get into a mode where like I'll get angry, I'll burst out in anger, I'll feel like a failure. And then I will like, well, how could I approach God with this? And I'll just hang on to it and wait a day and 2 days, right? And sometimes I still get in that cycle, and then God shakes me loose. And I've learned to, by his grace, accept his grace and move on. Like, I'm not perfect. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not engaging in any intentional ongoing sin, right? Like, I am just a man. But prior to that, years prior, like in the army and all those times I struggled, I would never breathe the name of God because of my behavior. Like, I wasn't going to be
disconnected.
I wasn't going to be a hypocrite.
Yeah.
So that's always been something that, and in these, I don't know how many years, 3, 4, 5 years, God has really allowed me to understand his grace.
That's good.
And even at work, like if I say something that is crass or disrespectful, like I will stop and be like, shouldn't have said that. And I'll just move on. right?
Yeah.
So there's an acknowledgement of
Yeah.
like, okay, like, well, Noto's pretty level-headed and calm most of the time, you know.
Yeah.
He said that thing that's kind of, and then he's, you know, so then now there's an understanding, and it's like, well, you don't have to be perfect
Right.
for Jesus, right?
Yeah.
But Jesus is there, you know, trying to, you know, before where I would get all bound up in my sin and feeling guilty, and that would just keep me from doing anything because I don't want to be a hypocrite,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Well, I mean, I've told you this, but I've seen a running pattern when I've interacted with police in the area, and I mention you that, you know, I've had multiple people who have been like, you know, using profanity, talking trash, and then I mention your name, and it's like all of a sudden their language cleans up, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Noto, he's a good guy." So whatever God has been doing in your life, you've been allowing Him to do, has clearly had enough of an impact to where others take note of who you are at work, and you know, I told her the last time that happened, we were on a walk and we were talking with a guy, and his whole demeanor shifted when we mentioned you. And I was telling her, I was like, you know, I hope people do that when somebody goes, "Yeah, do you know Jim?" That they go, "Oh yeah, Jim's a good guy." You know what I'm saying? Because that's, you know, I think of the book of Ruth, and Ruth's working in the field, and Boaz comes to check on the field, and all the workers stop what they're doing and they praise God for their boss. And it's like, that's a weird thing to think about. Like, oh, my boss just came in. Hold on just a second. Let me thank the Lord for him. God, thank you for this guy. You know what I'm saying? It's like to have the type of impact where just, you know, people go, "Oh yeah, that's a good person," you know? And, you know, I obviously I don't know, you know, I'm learning some of your testimony right here, right now. I don't know all your story, but I have to believe that if you do that at work and you're making those efforts at home, your kids are going to have every opportunity to know the Lord and make an impact on the world. And
I also take rest in, you know, I can't go do whatever I want and whatever sin that I want, but at the same time, if I'm seeking God and I'm messing up, you know, in Psalm, David is like, "For your own name's sake, rescue me and keep me."
yeah,
So, you know, even in times where I feel like a failure at work, or I've had a bad day, or, you know, whatever happens, and we give each other a lot of grace on the police department when people are having a bad day, not when people are nasty, but like, because it can be a lot. You know, it just takes one little thing at home and one little thing at work, and now you've got someone who's just barely hanging on.
Yeah.
You know, but
and it could be any of us at any day.
anytime,
Yeah.
you know, but I know that in pursuit of God, for His own name's sake, He's going to keep me, and He's not going to let my name get tarnished.
Yeah.
As long as I'm seeking Him,
Yeah.
right? You know, not for me
For His
or for how I look, but because,
Yeah.
you know, He's not going to look like a fool.
You said something a little bit earlier about when your family pet died and you felt you couldn't feel. So I think, I mean, there's a whole, I'm sure, science study behind like how your body responds and how your feelings are and all this stuff. All that to the side. The point I wanted to make was you and Rachel have served on the pastoral care team for a while now, and you guys take rotations with prayer time. And I think that it's really important that you can be a man that stands up there to pray for people who really are falling apart. And there are people who feel that and empathize with that. And I think there needs to be a balance where you can go, I'm going to stand here and be present and be strong with you and for you, and that you're not the one falling apart. There's a place for that, you know, and sure, there's a time that maybe later, you know, with whatever that you do process and fall apart. But my point is that I think that can be a strength where, where you don't need to obviously repress like everything your whole life, but to be a man who can be present and be standing there praying with your wife, with other people, and just them to feel that presence and that strength, you know? So I think that's good.
I was recently just going through Exodus and through the beginning of the Old Testament. And when Israel went into the Promised Land, you know, God commanded the armies of Israel to go in and kill everybody.
Yeah.
Go into, you know, so we gloss over a lot of things in the Bible, I think, right? Noah's Ark is all these fluffy stuffed animals, and that's not what happened.
No.
Okay,
Right.
so but with my life experience, what I visualize is a loved man of God in a tribe of Israel picking up a sword, going into a city and killing everything by the sword, and looking through his eyes as he beheads babies, as he kills everything. He still has to go home to his family, right? God made him that way to endure that task that other people couldn't do. They just couldn't do it. And we're all different, and it's glaring when you get a soldier or an officer who's new and you can tell they can't do the job and they just can't, and they have to go somewhere else. It's just the way God made them. They're not bad people. They just have a different set of skills. And it really brought that home of like reading that, being like, man, like that's pretty savage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just like taking a step back and being like, wow, I couldn't imagine having to do that,
Right.
Right.
and
Right.
not sinning. You're commanded by God. That's the task that you were given to go do. And whew,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now we're under a new covenant, and then we have a different way of doing things, and but the world is still just as broken and filled with evil, and
it's brutal.
It's brutal for sure. So I appreciate you coming in and doing this.
Yeah.
And if you are watching this right now and you have an opportunity to connect on a Sunday, find Anthony and his wife Rachel. They'd love to connect with you. If any part of this testimony resonates with you, and maybe you've walked through something similar and you'd like to have a conversation, I know Anthony would be more than willing to connect with you. I understand he likes coffee, or at least coffee shops, or at least donut shops by his own testimony.
There's always a good donut.
There's always a good donut. I know he'd carve some time out.
Yeah.
Just remember that, the scripture says that the enemy is defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony.
Amen.
And we want to be faithful to be sharing our testimony, what God's doing in our lives and through us. And by doing that, because the blood's already been shed, we'll find victory in our lives.
And I want to encourage the young couples, get to know some of the couples who have been through some stuff. Get to know Rachel and Anthony, and we're in community together. We're better together. And so thank you again, Anthony, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.